Hi everyone. I'm going to make a start in a second. I'm Robin Sloan from Abertay University, and today what I want to talk to you about over this lunch period is a reflection on a symposium that we hosted at Abertay University in Dundee in Scotland about accessible gaming. So I'll just share my slides and walk through some of those first, and then there'll be time for discussion. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A at that point. Okay, that should be my screen shared now. If there's any issues, I'm sure you'll let me know. So as I said, I'm from Abertay University, and we had a collaboration with RNIB. My name is Robin Sloan. I'm a senior lecturer at Abertay University. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a quite middle-aged senior lecturer these days. And we've been delivering games degrees here at Abertay University since 1997, so we've got a lot of experience there. And as I said, what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about an event that we ran that was instigated by RNIB and which aligns with a lot of my own interests, my own background being within the games industry and teaching and researching around game design, and my own interests in how do we make games more accessible, inclusive for all. So how did this come about? The Accessible Gaming Symposium, it took place in October, this past October, the 5th and 6th. It was a hybrid event, so we ran it online and in person. It was actually the very first event that I'd run in person, or the first one I planned to run in person since the COVID pandemic started in the UK. So it was really exciting to see people back on campus and collaborating that way. So it came about through a connection from RNIB, who reached out to us at Abertay, and they had this explicit aim of trying to grow conversations that would be taking place around accessible gaming for vision impaired gamers, and also vision impaired developers, which was one of the things I've had a long-standing interest in too. And it focused on bringing together stakeholders from gamer communities, which were absolutely at the heart of what we were doing, but also games industry professionals, technology leaders, so those with expertise in accessible technologies, for instance. Academics such as myself, whose day-to-day job is generally teaching the future workforce and researching around games, and of course advocates for vision impaired people such as RNIB. And the event centered on a couple of main things. One was invited talks and panels, which kind of set the groundwork for our conversations, and the main part of the event, which was breakout sessions, which I'll come to. So first of all, our panels, they set the foundation for the discussions that we were having, bearing in mind the diverse stakeholders that we had in attendance. As an example, on day one, we had Ben Breen from RNIB, who's also taking part in the event this week. And he chaired a session on the experience of playing games with vision impairment. And I think that was a really informative session. I think as game developers, as game designers, and as researchers, it's quite often difficult to get past our own assumptions about what it might be like to play a game with a vision impairment. So it was very enlightening actually to learn more about how vision impaired gamers actually engage with games and how they use the features within games. And on day two, we were really privileged to have Tara Walker from Xbox attend us in person and share a session on how do we design for gamers with vision impairments. And also a large part of that panel was about how designing for gamers with vision impairment is really about designing a good game design for everyone, really inclusive design. And that was kind of a theme that kind of carried on through the event. As I said, one of the main purposes of coming together and with RNIB to run this event was to try and target a range of different themes. And these themes kind of came from RNIB. They were shaped by RNIB by their previous research, the previous discussions with different stakeholders, with knowledge of the types of activities that we could be looking to do better work or more work around, to develop knowledge around. And very generally, these were participatory design, which is hard to say, knowledge sharing around learning resources, and what kind of learning resources and tools could be useful for people, developers in particular, motivations and mandates for making video games accessible, so kind of policy research there, infrastructure, which I guess is one of my own personal interests, because by that we mean the tools and technologies that are used to make games and how they're actually developed in practice, the kind of production side of games. So i.e. things like game engines, how games are made, And there's a lot of challenges there in integrating good accessibility and vision impairment accessibility into games where the tools don't support that very well. So that's an interesting topic to focus on. Interface challenges, which is again one of the main things that comes up a lot in our own teaching around accessibility also, like how do you design more inclusive, more accessible interfaces and make them accessible for all. And also lastly, future research areas for accessible gaming, which I guess is where we kind of come in as university. What are the kind of pots of funding or research projects that we could help shape and develop that might help improve both the experiences for gamers who are playing games, but also I think the experiences for developers in making better games, helping them to develop the games they want to make. I want to do a quick shout out at this stage for my colleague Abertay, Dr. Lindsay Shepherd. She chaired the participative design panel and contributed to the conference. Lindsay's a cybersecurity lecturer and a user experience research expert, but she's actually written a blog about this event and it goes live on the Raise the Game website today at 1 p.m. GMT. So hopefully we can share that link in the chat, but you'll also see that go live. And this page has obviously not worked. There's text that's appearing here that shouldn't be on my screen, but there's a couple of quotes here that I wanted to kind of focus on from the games industry themselves. What I wanted to note here was that we had obviously vision impaired gamers participating in the event, but actually primarily there was also the industry there, and I think it was important to reflect on feedback from industry being very positive about engagement with VI gamers. So apologies that this text seems to have not appeared correctly, so I'll skip over that and go straight to some of the things that we're going to be doing next. Now, it was a two-day event. There was around about 60 participants, approximately maybe a third in person and the remainder online. There was a lot of conversation, a lot of topics were discussed, and we had lots of notes, which I still haven't gone through fully. But my own reflections on what I felt were the kind of key themes that came up around accessible gaming for vision impaired players and developers were the following. Firstly, we were looking at user interfaces and user experience research. I think that's a topic we presumed would come up quite a lot, but for instance, things like graphics resolution. What are the resolutions of games and how is, for instance, the introduction of 4K potentially making things more complex and more inaccessible, actually. It's kind of counterintuitive. Lots of discussion around things like use of text and how text is integrated into games. I think that was a key one. Again, it's something we'd often focus on in games education, is how text is used. But also other things I thought were really interesting around things such as graphical style and how different graphical styles can actually be more or less accessible, something that we could be thinking about more in game art direction and user experience design. Game genres was a very interesting topic that came up. And I think, again, this lies at the heart of the kind of work we do in teaching and educating around games, is how do you support players to engage with and make the gameplay more accessible for different types of game, especially action-oriented games, fast-paced games, games that maybe have multiple decisions happening at once. Game genres introduce so much variability into how games are played that sometimes there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to making these games more accessible. So it'd be interesting to do more research in that. I think games developers in particular, some of the feedback was around that. Would love to do more for accessibility, but sometimes the games they're working on, it's hard to see what is the right decision to make. Game difficulty was something that came up, and I think that's a very interesting one as well, around the idea that quite often, or at least sometimes, accessibility in games might be unfairly tied to the difficulty of a game, when really that's not necessarily what gamers are looking for. Gamers might want difficulty, they might want challenge, and the introduction of accessibility features shouldn't necessarily be to kind of make the game simpler or easier. So how do you separate these two issues, the game difficulty as in the challenge of the game versus the difficulty of accessibility as being a separate issue, and treat those distinctly. Audio description was one of the key themes throughout the event as well. I think it's something that I'm looking to follow up on with colleagues elsewhere. How is audio description used in games? I mean, it is already being used in games, for instance, in cutscenes and helping to describe interfaces. But again, this issue of what games are, that they're dynamic, that they're interactive, that they change from moment to moment. The issue of having audio description within gameplay, having it dynamic, that's an interesting challenge, I think, for us to be looking at in the future. We, of course, were talking about policy research as part of this, and although everyone was in broad agreement that there's, the economic benefits of accessibility are clear and well evidenced already, but what could we do to kind of demonstrate most clearly the economic, social, societal benefits of integrating accessible features right across the board into games to ensure this is something that's kind of baked into best practices, baked into education, and baked into policy. And lastly, something that I thought was particularly intriguing was the idea of representation within games, and on two fronts. One of better representation of vision impaired people within games. I mean, there's not particularly strong representation of characters or people with vision impairment within games, and it was noted by some participants that often when there is, it's in a negative sense, or it is the defining characteristic of that person, so it's not very good representation. So how do we get better representation of vision impaired people in games narratives? But also, and I think this kind of strikes home to me more clearly as an educator, how do we do better vision impairment support within the games industry itself? How do we ensure that games developers, games publishers are well supported to have vision impaired people working within their organizations? Because of course that would impact on the former, that would increase the voice of those people and also make game development more inclusive. So that was a kind of general reflection of what we talked about at the event and the kind of follow-ups that we're looking to do in the coming weeks and months. I'm really happy to kind of have a conversation, answer some questions in the chat. So I'll stop sharing my screen for now. And come back into the room. Now, apologies if you've heard a cat, because all I've heard for the last 10 minutes has been my cat. So hopefully that's not coming through. But I'd be very happy just to kind of look through your questions and anything that you would like to ask or talk about, chat about. Happy to talk. I'm having a look just now. I can see there was a comment right at the start from Dom, from UK. Hi, Dom. It's nice to see you here. And the question there was, when developing the symposium, did RNIB or Abertay have any pushback, or was it green lit to go the actual day? So I think there was never really anything holding us back to do this event. I think it's been something we've been very keen to do. I would say as an educational institution, obviously accessibility lies at the heart of what we do in teaching and in research. And also in terms of our delivery of education of game design, accessibility is something that we like to focus on. I think for a number of years, I've been quite keen to figure out ways of integrating accessibility design more directly into everything that we do within games. I think historically in games degrees and games education, there's a tendency to kind of focus on things separately, which is maybe you focus on level design and then you focus on character design, or you focus on programming, and then you might also have a focus within a module or a course on, for instance, inclusive design or accessibility. And I've always been kind of dissatisfied with that kind of approach to teaching, because for me, teaching design and teaching students how to design games and teaching students how to design for accessibility are one and the same thing. So if we're teaching design, we should be teaching accessibility as part of that. So I was very keen to kind of get this event greenlit, as you said, very quickly, and it was greenlit on the day that I asked about it. We had everything in place. And I think in particular, although we've had a relationship with RNIB in other parts of the university previously, this kind of strong focus on games has been something that RNIB I know are pushing to develop this year and going forward. And I think absolutely I can see this being something that our university more widely, and I should say it's me speaking here today, but there was a quite a large number of Abertay researchers and students who attended our event and are engaging with it. We've already got undergraduate students who are working on vision impaired, accessibility for vision impaired gamers as part of their final year projects as a direct consequence of the event. So it's been really useful. Okay, looking down, so we've got a question here from Chris. Where are we? So we've got beyond the Last of Us. So the Last of Us 2 is going to be well renowned for accessibility, and God of War Ragnarok has just been released this week, and it's also been renowned for its kind of audio described titles. Any favorite audio games? You mean games that are audio only? I think audio only games or audio centric games is something I'm very interested in. Actually, one of the student projects that I've got developing is around developing of RPG games, so quite complex games. We're talking about game genres. And there's good examples of narrative-driven games that are audio-centric games, particularly for mobile also. But I'm really keen to develop this student project around role-play games where there's quite complex rule sets for mobile, and that's going to be an audio-led game. So I think that's really interesting. I agree with the sentiment. Like a lot of the mainstream media coverage of audio described titles tends to focus on these big AAA titles, and I think it's great that those are accessible. But there's also this kind of wider pool of games that we should be looking at. So in terms of audio, favorite audio games, favorite audio only games, there are a number, but I think that my interest just now is actually looking at this. How do we do more complex game genres like role-play games? I would love to see how we could do that better, and that's why I'm kind of encouraging student projects there. Okay. Just scrolling down to see if there's anything else that wants to chat about. I mean, I can keep reflecting on my own experience. I think I should say my background in game design. I think having participated in this event and got to chat with a number of vision impaired players like Jonny or like Ben Breen, who's at the event. I think it's kind of made me more aware of the need to integrate vision impaired gamers directly into game development. I think that's one of the things I can take away from the event. There was a number of assumptions that I had made and maybe biases I'd had as someone without vision impairment that I think kind of came to the fore during the event, and it made it obvious that we need to be rethinking these things. So I think something I'm quite keen to explore going forward is how do we get more vision impaired players involved in game testing, but also informing game development. I know the games companies are interested in this also, so I think that's something we're really keen to kind of take forward. I saw something come up there from Daniel there, right? So you mentioned infrastructure was a topic, the tools to create games. So what challenges did the symposium identify with our current approach to platforms, the platforms that are available? Okay, I think a lot of the conversation there within games kind of centered on game engines themselves. So a lot of game developers, for instance, might use game engines such as Unity or Unreal, the kind of mainstays of game development just now, but actually game development is much more fragmented than that. A lot of studios use in-house engines or other engines also. And even those kind of mainstream engines don't necessarily make it easier, straightforward to integrate, for instance, audio description. So there's a kind of, I guess, increased costs in terms of development time and how to integrate these features directly into them. And I think that was something we've identified. I think speaking to game engines such as Unity, we also had another game engine maker, Yo-Yo Games, who make Game Maker, a 2D game engine present there. And it was clear there that there's an interest and a strong desire to make accessibility tools more directly accessible and easy to use and integrated into the engines from the get-go. I think that's something that we need to work towards, because as I said, this fragmentation of the game development makes it challenging. But it's also tied, I think, to a bit of the know-how. Developers want to do good, accessible design, and there are good resources out there that are already there. But for instance, audio description, how to integrate audio description into a game engine. There's some support there, but it isn't always straightforward. It sometimes causes more problems, or maybe needs a lot of extra work. So it needs a dedicated team to deliver it. So it's something that games companies have to account for in their resource. But as I said, there's also maybe knowledge gaps around how to integrate audio description beyond things like cutscenes or interface integration to other aspects of the game that perhaps need audio description to become truly accessible and functional. Yeah, just looking to see if I've missed any other questions. Okay, so I think one thing I'll touch on as well is I think this is not just a topic for Abertay, but most games universities, and we speak to a lot of games universities, we do a lot of live projects. One of the main ways that we teach how to make games is by doing live projects with clients on specific challenge areas. And I think one of the things I'm very keen to do going forward, and this is an instance of what we're going to do at Abertay next semester, and I really encourage other universities to do the same thing, is actually assign student teams briefs where they're actually going to focus a little bit on accessibility. And perhaps also those kind of challenging areas, so they can kind of learn from the experience of trying to integrate features. It addresses issues such as how do you integrate the technology, because it gets students focused on those problems. But I think it also it makes the player centered in the design process. So we're going to be running a brief with RNIB actually in the coming semester with students, where we're going to give them some of the challenges that came out of the symposium. I mentioned already that we're really keen to do audio only games as a separate project, and how do you, that touches on the issue of genre. How do you do an audio only or audio led game where the game can be played fully with audio only, but the genre is a complex genre like a role play game where there's maybe multiple decisions being made. The experience of kind of working on that brief, working on that project is beneficial to the students, but also kind of gives us things that we can reflect on and look at. But in terms of the briefs that we're running with RNIB, really interesting to look at things like, for instance, integration of better representation within game narratives. So we've got a brief there that's looking at how do you bring vision impaired characters and their life stories into games and make them more than a background character or more than someone who's defined only by their vision impairment, and try and increase inclusion there. But we're also looking at other kind of more technical challenges. Like I said, audio description is a very interesting challenge to me. We're all aware of the strengths and benefits of audio description in games, and we've seen lots of evidence of it working very well in other sectors, particularly television. But as a designer, I'm fascinated about how we do this. How do you, as a designer, how would I approach audio description from first principles of designing a game, thinking about that as we're designing a game? And Daniel just added to this here, did the symposium identify any accessibility challenges or opportunities with the way games design itself is, oh, it popped away, is taught? So yes, the actual in the classroom. I mean, I think, obviously our teaching is with accessibility in mind, so we kind of follow best principles for how do we do, for instance, image descriptions and accessible documentation. Within our teaching generally as a university, that's something that we're obligated to do. And I think it's right in that, you know, the education around something like games is not so straightforward. It's actually quite a challenging thing to do education on. It isn't a format that lends itself very well to kind of a standard model of, like, say, a lecture and a simple tutorial or discussion group. A lot of games education is experiential, and I think that lends itself its own challenges. So I think actually one of the key things for me, a lot of what we do in games education is, yes, teaching, or I say teaching, facilitating the experiences for students so they learn how to cooperate and work together and understand each other. So I think for me, ensuring that we have diverse student cohorts, diverse student teams, is a really key way of, I guess, improving insight and empathy with each other, and as a consequence of that, better understanding of how to design for more accessibility and for more inclusive design for wider audiences. So I think on that side, actually integrating more mixed teams is helpful. But in terms of the way that games are taught, I think that there is an inherent challenge, and one of the terms that we might use to describe digital games is video games, and I think that introduces an inherent bias in that we see games primarily as a visual medium. And I think sometimes it introduces these biases around, there are certain things that cannot be solved because it's a visual medium. And I think that's something that we need to tackle from grassroots, by ensuring the next generation of kind of talent are thinking about these problems. Every single design decision that goes into a game, I think, needs to be getting approached not purely from the idea of fun and balance and challenge, which is the kind of the principles of game design, but also inclusion. Like if you introduce any visual element, whether it's the interface or text or exposition of narrative in visual form, or even like movement on the screen or where things are laid out, that at every stage of that, you're thinking about a diverse group of users and how they're going to engage with that. And that doesn't obviously isn't just applicable to vision impaired players who we want to ensure that are getting the most of our games and they are playing games. but of course a whole range of different disabilities and other accessibility issues. And I think that's a challenge, I think, for teaching game design or other design fields generally. But yeah, inclusion of diverse teams and diverse teaching teams also is beneficial. Okay. I don't know if I've missed any other questions in here because it's popped around a little bit. See a comment there. Thank you from Chris there. Thank you. I think if you're interested in learning more about what we're doing, because I'm conscious that our time will be coming to close shortly, you can follow Abertay Game Lab on Twitter. It's just at Abertay Game Lab, and we can maybe share that in the channel, and we'll promote the kind of work we're doing with RNIB via that channel, including, I think, as we get hopefully a showcase of really interesting student solo and collaborative games made in the next semester, to kind of show off the kind of things that they've been working on and how they're approaching their understanding of inclusive design for vision impaired gamers. We'd also be really love to hear from people who are interested in gaming generally. We're very receptive. We are a university. That's kind of what we do. We like to chat. So if anyone's really interested in learning more about gaming or working on a project together, we'd be love to hear from you. And as I said, it's not just myself. I'm but one person in the organization. Our wider school includes user experience and accessibility experts, as well as other games design, game art, and game programming experts. And there's a whole range of people there that have got interests in how we improve accessibility and inclusion for vision impaired players. And with that, if there's any more last questions or comments, I'd love to respond to them. So I'll leave an opportunity there for someone to ask something. We've got 3 minutes left or thereabouts. Okay, I don't see any other comments or questions just now. So I'll, if I click ask, does that come through? I can just put our Twitter handle in there. I don't know if that comes through or not, or if that can be moderated and added. I can see it there. That's our Twitter handle. Please do give us a follow. And you can also reach out to me via Hopin and happy to chat further. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the rundown. And yes, to re-stress, our colleague, as I mentioned, our colleague Lindsay Shepherd's summary of the event will go live on the Raise the Game website, I think in a couple of minutes' time, if I'm right. So there'll be another analysis of what we learned from the event there. Thank you. Dom's just put the link in there as well. The Raise the Game. That is the blog link, I think. So yeah, welcome to read that. And as I said, please do get in touch if you want to chat. It's been put to the top. Yeah. Okay. So thank you everyone who's attended. Glad that people can come along to hear about our event. And please, yeah, get in touch with me and Hopin or via Twitter. I'm happy to chat more. Okay. Thank you.